Hello, and welcome to Foundations of Moral Theology, Fall 2025 edition. Looking forward to working with you all this semester. For those of you who've been doing the grad program for a while now, you're probably going to notice that this is a slightly different format, and we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. But the very first thing I want you to do before we dive into talking about the class and kind of going over some of the initial material that we're going to be discussing is I've set up an assignment on Canvas that I'd like for you to do. So if you would just please, kind of before we dive into things, go and fill out the assignment describing sort of your initial thoughts about Catholic morality. So just take a few minutes, go find that assignment there under the first module, and write down your at least mostly unadulterated thoughts about Catholic morality as we come into the class. So I will just pause here while you go and fill that out. Okay. So now that you have unpaused me after filling out your initial thoughts about Catholic morality, we can dive into things. One of the things, again, that you'll notice is for those of you who've gone through some other courses in the grad program like this is going to be a little bit different. This semester is going to be sort of a beta test for a new book and a new format for a lot of foundations of moral theology. We've been doing the grad program for 17 years now. And while that class isn't quite that old, I'm kind of ready to do some different things. You're going to be getting the exciting opportunity to do that with me. Some of the videos will probably be a little less polished than maybe in some of the other courses you've taken. So my apologies for that. But they also will be probably quite a bit shorter for the most part. It turns out that the kind of standards for academic accreditors and seat time have changed over the years. So we don't necessarily have to have the same sort of setup in terms of the length of all of the video lectures. And also, I'm going to try to still keep you seeing my face. I'm sure you would be all deeply sad not to have that as a part of your weekly activity. But to include not just sort of a big lecture kind of at the front, but to also do some video or audio responses to the discussions and assignments as we go along, so that it's a little less prepackaged uh, interaction with Professor Papsdorf and a little more kind of simultaneous, kind of responding to the issues of this particular course, not just in the discussion boards, but also on the video or in audio or in other kinds of feedback. So hopefully you'll be patient as I sort of experiment with some of these new arrangements. And I do hope it should make the class even more engaging and interesting as we work through the material. One of the things, of course, for this course, that's not usually a problem, right? The moral theology classes tend to be ones that people are happy and willing to discuss a great deal. So I'm kind of looking forward to that uh, as we go through the next 8 weeks or so together. Um, Another reason I have sort of modified the format of the classes is that I really want to uh, build in some flexibility, right? As I already said, both in terms of my feedback, but also a little bit more flexibility in you as the students having some ownership of the course and be able to help shape some of the topics we're going to talk about. We're also going to have some more kind of contemporary of the moment modules. So looking at some specific issues later on in the course that are kind of hot topics here in the fall of 2025. Also, I want to think a little bit more intentionally about connecting the class with some of the other courses that many of you have done in the program so far. So for a lot of you, you're coming out of a summer class that looked at St. John Henry Newman and thinking about his approach to theology, his approach to sharing and teaching about the faith. And so, like, one of the things that I really want to emphasize in this version of the class is fits very well with Newman's idea of sort of a notional approach or a notional knowledge versus a real approach or real knowledge. And so, for those of you who weren't in that course, basically, when Newman talks about a notional understanding, it's theoretical, right? It's in your head. It's something you can read in a book, or it's something you understand in the abstract. Whereas a real grasp of a thing, a real experience, is one that kind of really you do with the whole person, right? That you really grasp it in an experiential, whole person, body and soul kind of way, right? So that you can have, for example, sort of a notional understanding of, I don't know, say fasting, right? The idea that in certain religions you practice this period of abstinence from food for spiritual benefit, what have you. You can have a notional understanding of that without a real understanding, right? A real understanding could only be had by, actually fasting, right? And that once you've done that, then you have a very different kind of understanding, right? And there are going to be people who have practiced things over and over, who have a much deeper, more profound understanding of an experience or a reality than even people who might write books about it, right? You could have somebody who spent their entire life in the kitchen and is an amazing cook or chef, but who isn't really skilled in writing about it or talking about it theoretically. Um, and on the other hand, you could have somebody who writes lots of books about sort of the theory of cooking, but has very little practical experience, right? So what I want to do in this class is sort of shift it to have a little more focus on the real, a little more focus on the experience of Catholic morality and trying to think about it in a less abstract, less theoretical way. So another thing that you'll maybe notice or I will mention as we kind of go through is part of what I shifted in making that kind of change is we're using a different book. So in previous years, I used a book that was really about just a straight sort of academic presentation of Aquinas's ethics, right? And I think the book is actually called Aquinas's Ethics, and so it's a very systematic, very detailed treatment of the ethical system of Saint Thomas Aquinas from the 1200s, and it's a good book, and I think it's really important to understand Aquinas's understanding the Catholic morality. We'll certainly talk about it as we go along. But I decided to shift and try a new book this year. So hopefully, you all, if you haven't already gotten it, will get your copy of Happiness and Christian Moral Life by Paul Waddell. I just finished reading it a week or two ago, and I'm looking forward to going through and talking about it with you. Um, but it's a very different kind of book. It's a little more of a textbook, but I actually chose it because I found it to be um, really it's not a textbook in the way like a high school biology is, right? That he's really Waddell is trying to give you um, he's trying to convince you of the value of Catholic ethics, the importance of living uh, a moral life to attain true happiness. So while it is a bit more textbooky, it is also, I think, an attempt to present a very persuasive account of Catholic moral teaching and why it will lead to a happy life. Um, and one of the things I like about the book is that it certainly has sort of the systematic theoretical aspects of Catholic theology presented in there, but it is also very much engaging with Scripture, right? So in the opening chapter, there's a section on the Beatitudes. There's also a lot of engagement with um, specific figures from Catholic history. So we have St. Augustine and Dorothy Day in our opening chapter, right? And by presenting scripture, by wrestling with these Catholic figures, you get a sort of more holistic, a more multifaceted presentation of Catholic morality than just sort of the standard Thomistic set of principles and rules. Not that there's anything bad with that, um, but that it can just give a different kind of feel to morality, feel to ethics, than what we get sort of in this book. And so, again, one of the things I want to encourage you all to do as you're going through this course is to really ask some of those kinds of critical questions and to, um, raise objections, raise concerns, because this is really an area where there is a lot at stake. Moral issues are obviously very important in how we live our lives and how we um, teach and present the faith, or how we think about big political or economic decisions in our lives or in our culture. So there's a lot at stake, and we want to make sure we do it as well as we can. But again, one of the reasons I wanted to sort of take a different direction with the class, right, is that in my experience over the years, with doing a very sort of systematic, sort of principles and rules approach to Catholic morality, there can be a tendency to make it, again, very notional, very abstract and philosophical, in a way that doesn't really um, inspire, in a way that doesn't really um, connect it in a sort of living way with actually living out good, happy, flourishing lives, or really truly living out a Catholic faith. Um, and so this book and this version of the class is going to emphasize that a bit more. But I do think it's worth recognizing there's a tension there, right? That there are benefits to sort of the systematic approach, and there are challenges with the more real, synthetic, multifaceted approach. All right, so what do I mean by that? And so I want to start us off. So in the opening weeks of the course, we're going to spend a lot of time working through the book. I do think the book does a really nice job of kind of walking us through Catholic moral theology in a systematic sort of way. So the first sort of half or so of the course, we'll be doing that. And then the last half or third of the class, we will be applying what we've learned in terms of Catholic morality to a range of specific issues. We'll be talking about different ethical questions and issues as we go along. But the whole last third or so of the class will be sort of a deep dive into a handful of issues, using the principles and approaches that we're covering here through the book. So if you haven't bought the book, if you're is he actually going to use this book, we're going to use the book. So go ahead and get it. And so what I want to do in just the remaining time here for this opening video is walk through a little bit of chapter one, and point out some things that stood out to me and some things to think about as we go through this first module and start discussing it. Right. And so one thing, again, that struck me is just on page 2 of our text. So forgive me if I read a little bit here, but I think it captures a lot of what I'm trying to emphasize in this course. So the bottom paragraph there on page 2, Waddell says, Christianity offers another strikingly different but abundantly more hopeful understanding of happiness, as opposed to this sort of consumerist version of happiness he's just described that is popular in our culture. If we follow the path of Jesus, we discover the most satisfying life is not governed by self-interest, but is characterized by justice, generosity, faithfulness, truthfulness, courage, compassion, and even suffering love. In more theological language, if we ask how we can attain a truly good and happy life, Christianity answers that we will be happy when we are what God calls us to be, people of goodness, kindness, mercy, and forgiveness, people who come to life in loving and serving others. Christianity is an ongoing initiation into a genuinely good and happy life based on the conviction that God desires our happiness and, in the life, teaching, and example of Christ, shows us how to attain it. There is nothing any of us wants more than to know what counts as a good and happy life, a life that brings us peace and answers the deepest longings of our hearts. Christianity offers a compelling, if sometimes surprising, account of what that life would be. It is a life determined not by self-promotion or the gratification of every desire, but by transcending ourselves in undying love for others. So, there is a lot going on in that paragraph, but I do think it's a really good way to start off our discussion of Catholic morality, right? And that you'll notice in giving this introductory account of what this book is going to be about, it is not a list of rules. It's not a discussion of really avoiding sin. It is about living the best possible, most fulfilling, happiest human life, right? And that we, in fact, do that if we live in a way that fits with the way God made us, and if we live in a way that fits with the example that we see in the person of Jesus Christ. And by extension, the person we see in Jesus Christ, who is also a member of the Trinity, right? This one God in three persons, right? Who is defined by love, right? That God is love in a very real sense, right? That the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit um, are this are a constant love. Each person totally and completely loves the others and is completely and totally loved in return, right? And that's the very essence of who God is. And as human beings made in the image of God, we are going to be happiest when we don't focus in on ourselves. Again, for those of you who've gone through the program, if you think way back to the first course, this is one of the basic points that Father Guile made, right? That turn inward, that focusing in on yourself, that is really what is sinful. That is what distorts a person. That is what is wrong, a wrong way of living. Whereas a perspective on life that focuses on others, that focuses on relationships, that is defined by love, that is in fact going to fit with the way we were made, fulfill us in our nature, and lead us to be truly happy, right? And that's not, I think, one of the crucial things here to recognize, right, is that when we're talking about Catholic morality, again, we always, I think, have this tendency to fall back to a list of rules. And obviously, there's a place for rules in a moral life. But I think we get it wrong if we think of that as the essence, right? And I think it's important to remember the essence of a moral life is love, right? The essence of a moral life is living a life that is truly fulfilling and rich, as he's describing here in our text, right? So I think that's something we're really going to talk a lot about as we go through the next few weeks. Um, right, you think if we go a page or two further on to page 4, there was one other quote that I wanted to take a moment um, and share with you again to kind of get to some of these basic key principles. We'll be coming back to it again and again. So on page 4, sort of that middle paragraph, he writes, "What must we love and cherish if we are to reach the greatest excellence possible to us as human beings? Or more briefly, if not more simply, what would it mean to live a good and beautiful life? Learning principles and rules, being conversant with a variety of traditions and theories, and being skilled in addressing controversial moral issues are all crucial elements of moral education. But they are not the heart and center of any exploration of the moral life, because they present a much too constricted view of the moral adventure. The scope of morality is much grander and more momentous. Its essential business is not the solving of problems, but rather the growth and development of persons in the various goods that will truly fulfill them. Helping us discover and then achieve the most promising possibility for human beings is the primary business of ethics, because ultimately nothing less will content us. What would it mean to live a truly good life? How must we plan our lives so they can be lived as well as possible? What must we do, and more importantly, who must we become if we are to enjoy lives rich in meaning and purpose? Or more pointedly, what is happiness and how can we attain it? These are the questions that drive the study of ethics, right? And again, I think for some of us, this may strike us as obvious, right? So, um, yes, obviously, Professor Papsdorf, obviously, Dr. Waddell, right? The goal of life is ultimate happiness. Okay, but again, I think it's important to recognize what he's saying here is a specific claim about how Catholic morality ought to function. And I think it's also important, when I read that passage, I think none of us would be terribly shocked to hear that in a homily on a Sunday morning or to read it in a Catholic magazine. But in fact, it is actually a fairly controversial position to take, especially sort of as an introduction to a book on Catholic morality, right? Because on the one hand, it sounds engaging, it sounds Obviously, it's focusing on kind of the overall goal of the moral life, but I think many people would be critical of it, right? Many people might see this as sort of an opening to possibly downplaying the significance of some of those rules, of some of those principles, right? And so by emphasizing um, the richness of the Catholic life or finding ultimate fulfillment um, in our lives versus following a set of rules. There are going to be people who are going to wonder, is he going to use this as a way to get out of some of those rules or principles that he doesn't like? And as we get later into the book, this will become very clear on some particular issues, right? So, very end of the book, a little spoiler here, when there's a discussion of sexual ethics at the end, um, his treatment of it is certainly not going to run down sort of the standard list of Catholic principles on sexual ethics. And I think one could raise some reasonable critical questions about the presentation of sexual ethics that's offered there, right? And that if you take this emphasis on sort of the inspirational approach to ethics or sort of the holistic approach to a well lived life, you could do it in such a way that you use it as an out for avoiding the principles, right? And so that's going to be a tension to be aware of as we go through the class. So I do think I really enjoyed the book. I think he does a really nice job of presenting Catholic morality in an engaging way. Um, but for most of us, at least, this is a graduate course, and for those who aren't, you get to get a little advanced Catholic ethics here. Um, I think we should be raising critical questions about the text as we go along, and to recognize that even with a passage that probably to many of us sounds very obviously good and true, we should step back and think critically about it, and just be aware of at least some potential objections or ways that people could disagree and approach things differently. Okay, um, so why then use this book, right? So some of you might wonder, okay, Dr. Papsdorf, I came here to get a good, solid presentation of Catholic morality, and now you're telling me I'm not going to learn all the rules. Um, there is some truth to that, right? We're not going to cover every possible rule for every possible situation, in part because we can't do that in 8 weeks. We will sort of set you up to explore those issues when they come up and equip you so that you can get the answers you need or find the places where there aren't necessarily clear established answers, which there's going to be quite a few of those as well. So then why take this approach? Well, again, partly to mix things up, partly because I find it engaging, but I also think um, that I agree with Waddell's sort of fundamental point, and that is that if all that morality is, if all it remains is just a set of rules and principles, that doesn't really change lives, right? And I think the ultimate goal of this course, the ultimate goal of the grad program or the undergrad coursework as well, is to really transform lives, right? And I think that is why, one question people might have is, in the opening chapter of the treatment of Catholic morality, why spend all this time talking about St. Augustine and Dorothy Day? Um, why spend this time going through the lives of these two people? And two people who are in many ways very different, right? I mean, for those of you who know them, it might be surprising, probably is surprising to think, oh, right, if you're going to think of two characters to use to illustrate an approach to Catholic morality, um, probably Dorothy Day and St. Augustine wouldn't be the two that you would combine. Um, Catholics who are really into St. Augustine tend to not be really into Dorothy Day and vice versa, although obviously there are exceptions. Okay, so why on earth do we get these two stories? But I think what Waddell does is he shows that in both of these stories, you have people whose lives are radically transformed as they live out their faith, as they follow Catholic morality, right? And in both cases, it's not done on a purely theoretical level, right? Dorothy Day, she enters into a Catholic moral life through her experiences, her very colorful, very adventurous experiences as a sort of anarchist social protester um, who's fighting uh, oppressive economic and political structures, right? And she enters into Catholic morality through this very intense experiential approach. Um, and then only later kind of comes to write about it extensively, talk about it. But hers is a very much lived uh, Catholic morality, right? And with Augustine, we get someone who was wonderfully educated, brilliant philosopher, theologian, thinker. Um, but as the famous story goes, almost all of us probably know it, right? He isn't actually able to live it just from studying the theories, right? He has to have these other experiences in his life that lead him to finally embrace Catholic morality, not as a theory, but as a sort of a whole person embrace of this way of life. Very, again, reminiscent of John Henry Newman's sort of uh, real act of faith, real knowledge, real conversion, not notional, right? And so in both cases, you have this sort of whole person embrace of Catholic morality, and in both cases, you can see in their lives this sort of radical transformation, right? And again, I think that is something I would really like us to think about as we go through the class, because when we think about Catholic morality, I think one of the real challenges, especially for those of you who are going to teach it, um, is that there's a very reductionist way of thinking about Catholic morality, right? There are a lot of people who, if you really got them to say what they think being a moral person is as a Catholic, there's a list of, 5 or 6 really big sins. Don't do those. And then if you really want to get into Catholic morality, well, then you would study, what's the specific teaching for these very complicated end of life medical issues or in vitro fertilization or whatever it might be, right? And the Catholic morality is really just about avoiding the big sins and then sorting out the details on what to do with these really controversial, tricky scenarios. Um, but that, again, is not the way that Catholic morality is really meant to function, right? It's really meant to transform a person's life so that they live very richly, right? And we'll just end it off. I think one of my favorite quotes from the whole book is here in this opening chapter at the very end on page 32, when he's quoting this book, The Irresistible Revolution by Shane Claiborne, who was himself recalling a college professor who said, quote, all around you, people will be tiptoeing through life just to arrive at death safely. And I think that is a very striking description of how many people approach morality, right? It's all about tiptoeing through life, making sure you don't do any bad stuff, but really not living sort of this rich, full, adventurous life that Catholic morality has to offer. And so that's the main emphasis of this opening chapter. That's really the main emphasis I want for us in this course as a whole. So I'm going to ask you to respond to some of the discussion questions from Waddell's list as our opening discussion for this module. And if you didn't do it, shame on you. Make sure you go back and do your own initial impressions on Catholic morality. And obviously, one of the things we're going to do is think about as we go through the class, does our initial account of what Catholic morality is like match with what is presented in the course, in the book? And as we work through the class, maybe those come closer together, maybe they are further apart. It'll be interesting to discuss as we go along. So, sorry, this was a little longer than anticipated, but hopefully this will get us started. And if you have any questions or concerns, or if any of the instructions in Canvas are unclear, please don't hesitate to reach out. Send me an email, and I'd be happy to get back to you. And I look forward to talking with you in the weeks to come.